Welcome to Real Bible. I'm Carol Salee, and this video is brought to you by the Salee Group. In each episode of Real Bible, we will strive to apply real truth from a real book to real life. This is the second of 3 recordings I'm making that are kind of different than my Bible studies, and they have to do with the biblical timeline. In the first biblical timeline video, the one in the Old Testament, I give you a little bit more of an explanation, but I want to tell you why we're going to be looking at the Intertestamental Period in this particular video. When I first came out with my drawing that I showed in the last video about my attempt to figure out the biblical timeline with the Old Testament and the New Testament, and then my husband turning it into better looking charts than my chicken scratching, all I had was an Old Testament timeline, which is video 1, and a New Testament timeline, which is going to be video 3. Well, I got ready to do a Bible study that's also available on this YouTube channel. It was 2 parts, and the first part was Jesus and the Gospels, his life and ministry. And that video series, it's broken up into 1 week we look at miracles, parables, prayers. It's like a chunk of Jesus' life, all the Gospels put together to figure out that particular aspect of his ministry. And then the second part of that is called Passion Week. And in that study about Jesus, it looks at each day of Passion Week, what happened on Sunday, what happened on Monday, what happened on Tuesday. So when I'm in the midst of studying for Jesus and the Gospels, I realize that while this is great, that I have the Old Testament and the New Testament timelines, I need to do a little bit more research into the intertestamental period. It's 400 to 450 years of silence between the pages of Malachi and the pages of Matthew. But when I was studying Jesus, I realized there are significant things that occurred during that 400 to 450 years that had direct effect on Jesus' ministry, who he would interact with, how people felt about each other. So I thought I have to bear down and I have to see if I can do a little bit of conquering of the intertestamental period. I am not a historian. I don't have seminary level resources for me. And you've seen those glorious timelines that take up like a whole wall and there's lines going everywhere and there's colors. I needed something that was really stripped down, that was so much more simple than that. Something that I could fold up and keep in my Bible or even have on my phone. So this video is going to be about the intertestamental period. I won't be holding this up as long as I did the Old Testament one, but I would suggest that you pause the video and go and click on the link and download this intertestamental period, because there are a lot of names and a lot of information that are going to come out of this. And there are 2 books that were really helpful for me in discovering information about this time frame. One is the Holman Bible Dictionary. I don't know how you could be a student of God's Word and not have a resource like this. It has every name in the Bible, every place, spiritual concepts, maps. I mean, it's just sometimes like the other day I was doing a study on Hannah's prayer in 1 Samuel 2, and I needed to make sure I understood when it talks about he lifted up my horn, what exactly did that mean? So I went and I researched the word horn, but this had incredible information for me to use. And then this one, even more so. And I'm really not a map girl, but this is called the Holman Bible Atlas. But it is so much more than just maps. And of course, I open it to a page that has 2 maps on it. But it has a lot in it about the intertestamental period and who was in control at that time. It is filled with history. So if you are a map history buff, then this is the resource for you. You will not regret buying that. So I did a lot of research between those 2 books and put together the best I could a timeline for the intertestamental period. So I want to warn you that this is going to be a lot of information that is new to me. I just actually put this together for the last fall session that I taught. It's a new fall year for that, and I'm definitely going to have to use my glasses. But part of my warning is that I'm going to need to use my notes pretty extensively to be able to do this in an effective manner. And it's not my preference to be bogged down with notes, but it's a have to on this one. So let's get started. The Old Testament ends with the Babylonians in charge of what was the known world at that time. The northern kingdom of Israel, they're in Assyrian captivity. They've been deported. They've been mixed in with other races. And then the southern kingdom of Judah, where Jerusalem was, they have been in their 70 years of captivity. The first temple's been destroyed, a synagogue system has begun, and what we have, a new phrase called the diaspora Jews, is those Jews that were taken away from their homeland, and then they were going to be given a chance at a new life back in the promised land, in the land of Israel. And so the first conquering nation that comes after the Babylonians is the Persian Empire. But I want to give you some details on the Babylonians, and this is from my notes that are setting right here. We're still in the Old Testament, and through Nebuchadnezzar's army, the Babylonians, they took over Jerusalem, destroyed the city, burnt the temple, the palaces, and the homes. And Jeremiah has said, you need to settle in. We're going to be in Babylonian captivity for 70 years. And many Jewish refugees also settled in Egypt during this time. And that kind of sets us up, this Jewish community back in Egypt, for some prophecies about Jesus that will fulfill words from like Hosea 11:1 that says, I will call my son out of Egypt. That's fulfilled in Matthew chapter 2, whenever they are refugees for a while in the land of Egypt. What's during this time in exile, that during the Babylonian exile, that the Jews came up with the synagogue system. And you had to have at least 10 Jewish men to have a synagogue. But the synagogue, they're away from their homeland, they're away from their central place of worship in the temple, and they can come together in the synagogue, and they can try to retain who they are as a nation, who they are as a religious group in the synagogues. Well, part of the reason that that's important for the New Testament is that Jesus is going to go into the synagogues when he starts his ministry. Into the book of Acts in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul is going to always go into a synagogue when he gets into a new city and he wants to share the gospel. Through the prophets, Babylon had been warned that they would be punished for their treatment of God's people. And so Babylon becomes kind of conceptually known as a symbol for forces that oppose God's kingdom. So you'll even see references to Babylon all the way into the last book of the New Testament, Revelation. Well, the next group that comes along is what's called the Persian period. It's also called Mede-Persian, and that's because Cyrus, who was the king of Persia that conquered Babylon and all of Babylon's former territories, he had a Persian dad and a Mede mom. So you might hear it called the Persian period, you might hear it called the Mede-Persian. Well, the Persian period spans about the last 100 years of the Old Testament and about the first 100 years of the Intertestamental Period. And remember, that's about 400 to 450 years. Cyrus allowed those Jews who wanted to go back to Judea. That's that southern kingdom. And I talked in my last video, it's confusing for us because the names of places change. But that southern kingdom where the temple had been before it was destroyed by the Babylonians, it's Judea. And he says can go back, you can rebuild your city, you can rebuild your temple. So that brought an end to the Jews' exile, and many of them are going to make their way back to Jerusalem. And for some of them, they were 1,000 miles away from home, but they were so dedicated to the task to come back. Well, Zerubbabel is going to be the primary builder on the second temple. And one of the things we need to take note of, because it matters in the New Testament, is the Samaritans. Those are the ones that were kind of mixed in with other races during their Assyrian captivity. They came and offered to help, and the Jews refused. Well, as a result of that, the Samaritans built their own temple to try to keep their people kind of contained. Well, during this period of this Persian Empire is where we get some of those history books like Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. They're contained in this Persian period. And events in those books took place toward the end of the Old Testament, even though, remember this, they're placed much earlier in the table of contents whenever you see the biblical books. And it's because books from the Old Testament were put together by type, and they're considered history books. And there's the first 5 books of the law and then the 12 history books. Well, Aramaic, which was closely related to Hebrew, became the dominant language among the returning exiles, and that is the language that Jesus spoke. Well, prophets of the exile include Ezekiel, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. And in their writings, they're trying to answer some challenging questions. And here's some example of their questions. Why had God sent the Jews into exile? Weren't they his promised people? Was God finished with the Jewish people? Did he have more for them? Would they get to go to their homeland? And if they got to go home, what should they expect? And could they have hope for a future restoration? Well, on the heels of the Mede Persians came the Greek period and Alexander the Great. And even for someone who's not a huge history buff, I can remember Alexander the Great. Well, he defeated the Persians and he combined Egypt, what is now called Palestine, which contains Judea, Galilee, and Samaria, also Syria, Asia Minor, Greece, and the Persian territories into this vast empire. And Alexander allowed the Jews to have religious freedom. They could continue to have their one God and to follow their law. However, what went on during this Greek period is a thing called Hellenization. And Hellenization was the Greeks' process of blending their worldly and ungodly culture with native cultures and that's where the term Hellenization came from. That is going to continue from here on out. The Jews are going to be battling this entire time, and it's something that Jesus will run into. It's something that in the book of Acts the apostles will run into. Paul will address it in some of his writings. It actually prepares the way for the Christian movement and will bring some essential changes into Judaism. For example, in Acts 7, there's direct mention of Hebraic Jews, which are Jews that were born in Jerusalem area, and then there's the Hellenistic Jews. And those are Jews that were part of that diaspora, that were born outside, away from the land that was promised to the Jews. Well, Greek becomes the international language during this time, and during this time, the Hebrew Old Testament was translated into Greek. And that translation is called the Septuagint, and it's the version of the Old Testament from which Jesus will quote biblical verses from. And so that's what I mean when I say I wanted to put this together for that Jesus in the Gospels study. It's because there's just little like breadcrumbs of what's going to happen in the Gospels that are laid out during this intertestamental period. Well, next is the Ptolemaic period. The P is silent. That was a real hard one for me to learn how to say. And during the Ptolemaic period, those kings governed Palestine, and during about 323 to 198 BC, they allowed the Jews to govern themselves and to observe their religious customs. It was really important for the Jews to be able to continue to have their one God. Because you see, one of the things that got them in trouble was that they were always bringing in false gods. During the time whenever the Babylonians were threatening them, they were thinking, well, we'll have our God and we'll bring in the Assyrian gods. Those gods look like they're doing good things for the Assyrians. Oh, let's bring in the Egyptian gods. Looks like the Egyptians are winning now. And they were constantly pursuing other gods besides the one true God. Well, the Babylonian exile got their attention, and so they're really trying to stay focused just on God as their one and only true God. So the Hellenization threat is of great significance to them because they're trying to bring themselves back into full obedience to God, and it can't include false idols or false gods. So there continues to be Greek influence and Hellenization, and even greater value is given to the synagogues because the Jews want to keep the law. They want to keep what makes them unique as a nation with God as their leader. After the Ptolemaic period comes the Seleucid period. And we're going to have to do a little bit of dates here. I don't expect you to remember these. There's no quiz on this. But in 198 BC, Antiochus III was the ruler of the Seleucids, and he defeated the Ptolemaic kings and annexed Palestine. Remember earlier I mentioned that Palestine consisted of Judea, Galilee, and Samaria. And he ruled from Alexandria, Egypt. Well, the Seleucids continued to allow religious toleration until about 175 BC, when Antiochus IV Epiphanes, he came to power, and one of his capital cities was Syria. Well, Antiochus Epiphanes, he supported the radical Hellenization of Jerusalem, and he outlawed Judaism, made pagan worship mandatory, and brought in foreign mercenaries to maintain order. The Jews were no longer allowed to observe circumcision, their Sabbath, or any of their festivals. And it got so bad that an altar to the Syrian god Zeus was erected in the Israelites' second temple that Zerubbabel built. Animals that were forbidden by Mosaic law were sacrificed on the temple altar, and prostitution was sanctified or sanctioned in the temple. So you can see how much it has digressed for the Jews at this time. And the position of high priest, which was supposed to come from the tribe of Levi, it was a lifetime appointment, kind of turned into a little bit of a political game. And so almost like a type of fundraiser, the Seleucids would give the high priest appointment to the person who paid the most money. So it really had nothing to do with the Levitical line as it was commanded in the law. Well, it was during this particular time that Jewish zealots became quite active in trying to overthrow these foreign nations. And one of Jesus' disciples was Simon the Zealot. And that was one of the things that was noteworthy about the Zealots, is they wanted to do whatever it took, violence included, to be able to get back control of the nation of Israel. Well, after the Seleucid period comes a hyphenated time, the Maccabean Hasmonean period. And this is a really interesting time in Jewish history. The Hasmoneans were a priestly family consisting of Matthias and his 5 sons, who waged ongoing successful revolts against the Syrians, as well as attacks on Jews who had abandoned the Torah. Well, one of these sons was Judas Maccabeus, whose nickname was the Hammer. Sounds like something we would see in professional wrestling. And when these revolts began to have greater success, Antiochus Epiphanes revoked prohibitions against the Torah. So he realizes, I'm kind of losing here. I'm going to loosen some of the restraints that I have on them. Well, during the revolts, the Jews destroyed the Samaritan temple. And near to the time of Jesus' birth, the Samaritans defiled the Jewish temple by spreading bones of dead people in it, which further explains the hatred that was present in Jesus' day between the Jews and the Samaritans. With the Samaritan woman, we have the Good Samaritan. I mean, he really comes to reestablish them as a people. Well, under the leadership during this Maccabean Hasmonean period, the Jews were free for the first time since 586 BC, and they are going to enjoy this freedom as an independent state for 80 years. However, this dynasty, the Maccabean Hasmonean dynasty, degenerated through a series of unfit kings, and their political aims alienated many former supporters, including groups who split into the Pharisees and the Essenes. And aristocratic supporters of the Hasmonean kings became the Sadducees. So I, for some reason, again, just not knowing my Bible, just assumed that the Pharisees and the Sadducees were just always a part of the Old Testament, always a part of Jewish history. But it's during this time, during the Maccabean Hasmonean period, when these significant groups come out. And the Sadducees were kind of the upper class. They had the most money, they had the most power, they had the most prestige. And not under them, but beside them were the Pharisees. And the Pharisees were the ones who really made it a point to follow the law. So much so that they added additional laws and made the law a great burden to people. Like, just got meticulous with the law. But part of the mentality was, we want the Messiah to come. We want him to come and redeem us. We want him to come and ensure that we have this freedom. So the mentality was, if we can be really pure, then the Messiah will come. And so that was the reason behind those laws. It was a desire to usher in the Messiah. It just became such a tedious undertaking for the Israelites at this time and for the Jewish nation. And then we have the Sadducees. By the time we get into when Jesus is here, they're cooperating with Herod. They really don't want the apple cart upset because they have much more to lose than the other groups. And then the Essenes, again with that mentality of we need to be pure, kind of separated themselves out into wilderness type living, and they were even more strict. And they added even greater rules and guidelines for trying to stay as pure as possible. Well, in 67 BC, a war broke out between two brothers who were both fighting for the title of high priest and king, which again shows you how far we've come from the Levitical line. And they both appealed to, of all groups who have done this, they appealed to Rome, because Rome was becoming a powerhouse. They appealed to Rome to settle the issue, which effectively invited in the Roman general Pompey, who came in and conquered Jerusalem in 63 BC and brought Judea directly under Roman rule. And that's where we kind of end the intertestamental period and enter into the New Testament period, is during the Roman period. When Jesus shows up on our planet, he's going to have direct interaction, and things are going to happen with his family and in his life because of his interaction with the Romans. So the intertestamental period ends, the New Testament period begins, and we have a lot to understand about the Romans. because they provide the historical setting for all New Testament events as it relates to Jesus and the early church. The Romans created conditions that were actually necessary for the spread of the gospel. For example, there was a way of thinking called Pax Romana. And Pax Romana, if I can give it a simplified definition, is peace at all cost. That Rome came in and said, okay, Jews, you can still do your religion. You can still just have your one God. We just need there not to be any kind of a ruckus. We need there to be peace. And if you can't keep yourselves under control, then we will come in and control you. So it's set up for Rome to have be calling all the shots at this time. And that's who's directly involved in the crucifixion of Jesus and the plot to cover up his resurrection, all of those things. They created a highway system, which means there's greater travel and greater commerce. With greater travel, really has something to do with the book of Acts. Whenever the gospel gets ready to hit the road and the gospel goes to the ground and the apostles are out and missionaries are out, those roads that the Romans built made it easier for the gospel to find its way to the ends of the earth. There's further absorption of Greek ideas, continued Hellenization, which helped Greek be a common language. And while Roman culture remained Greek, there's distinctive central administration with the Romans. But how effective is it that there's kind of one language so that when the gospel gets on the move, it's a language that people can understand. They don't have to necessarily be able to speak the language of the Hebrews to be able to understand the gospel. Well, Pompey delegated much of the former Hasmonean territory to the Roman governor of Syria, and he appointed an Idumean, which is a descendant of Esau. Isaac had twin sons, Esau and Jacob. So this is like I said in the last video, this is kin that's doing this. And he named Antipater and his sons, Phasael and Herod, as governors of Judea and Galilee. And Herod is the governor of Galilee, and Jesus, in his time, is going to have interaction with him. So after a war with the Parthians, Rome confirmed Herod the Great as ruler and even called him king. He's going to rule over Judea, Galilee, Idumea, Samaria, and Perea. And he is who was in charge when Jesus was born, and he is who ordered the slaughter of Bethlehem's infant boys. So you can see, sometimes we think, why do we need to know this world history? Well, it's because world history directly intersects with biblical history. And of the gospel writers, Luke is the one who makes sure that we understand here's what's going on in world history whenever God is doing his part to bring a Messiah to our earth. Herod expanded and beautified the temple in Jerusalem. He promoted Hellenistic culture, but his reign was filled with all kinds of political intrigue. There were plots, there were murders, there were wars, brutality, until his death in 4 BC. His sons ruled over separate parts of Palestine into the New Testament period. Well, during these years of Roman control, Rome was generally tolerant of Judaism. However, throughout the period of Roman domination, sporadic Jewish resistant movements emerged. For example, the Zealots at Masada. And so those are other parts of history that we don't have time to go into. And speeding through well past the time of the New Testament being written, we see that due to violent revolts by Jewish zealots, Rome finally comes in. And as prophesied by Jesus, destroyed the temple in 70 AD. And then it changed the nature of Judaism. It changed the nature of Christianity, and there's much more that could be told beyond what happened in the pages of the New Testament. Wow, was that a crash course in intertestamental period? I don't know if that will help you in any way, but what I love about that is seeing the hand of God in making sure that the situation and the circumstances are set up for the entrance of his Son. Galatians 4:4 says that in the fullness of time, Jesus came. Well, the events in the intertestamental period, they're part of the fullness of time. They're part of God getting things ready for Jesus to come and for his gospel to be shared throughout the ends of the earth. Thank you so much for watching another one of these timelines. We have one more to go, and it will be even shorter. It'll be the New Testament timeline, but by the end of these 3 videos, you should have kind of a holistic overview of the biblical timeline, where the Bible books land, some significant events in those parts. Thank you so much for watching.